You go by many titles: Dad,
It's time to get out.
No.
Night Manager, and Carpool Captain.
Hey guys, let's go, come on. Everybody in.
So adding a student title might feel daunting. But what if a school could be there for all of you? Career, family, finances, and mental health. National University believes supporting all your titles can lead to another one. Successful graduate. National University, supporting the whole you. Learn more at nu.edu.
Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And today we're going to be talking about two fires in North Carolina that both occurred in 1831. The first occurred in Fayetteville on May 29, 1831, and the other occurred in Raleigh on June 21, 1831. And Chris, that's only about 3 weeks apart.
You know, one of the things that I love about history is we hear about the big stories. We're familiar about the Great Fire in Chicago or the Great Fire in London, and all of these that are taught maybe in history classes. But here are two statewide fires that we hear about, and through our podcast today about history you didn't know but should. We really need to understand the fire of Fayetteville, as basically Fayetteville will be no more after 1831, and then in Raleigh. The fire in Raleigh almost changed the course of history for the entire state of North Carolina. So these are two really fascinating and interesting fires that basically you and I just happened upon, if you will, because of one of our previous podcasts when we were talking about the Market House in Fayetteville. So that's what I love about our podcast, is that they just kind of take us in different places and allow us the opportunity to learn some really interesting stories about history.
Yeah, and when we start talking about the fire in Fayetteville in May of 1831, I think we can start with the words of Reverend Henry Rowland, the pastor of the First Presbyterian Church there in Fayetteville at the time. He wrote a letter, and we will come back to this letter a little later, but he wrote a letter to the editor of the National Gazette, and it starts off, "Sir, Fayetteville is no more." And when we look at the Fayetteville fire of May of 1831, Chris, it wasn't just one building. It wasn't just a few structures. It was basically the whole city at that time.
For individuals to really get an understanding of how devastating this fire is, it took place on a typical, beautiful Sunday morning in May. Everybody was waking up, going about their normal rituals. And for many, that was going to their various churches of worship in Fayetteville. There were many different denominations that had churches in the downtown area, and people had gathered for church. And a little afternoon on May 29th, as they were coming out, they saw that this fire had started, it seems, from a kitchen in a home in the center of the town. And the next thing you know, as you mentioned, Fayetteville was destroyed. And we have to ask ourselves, because we live in 2021 and we're able to think of a fire department rushing out, being able to limit the fire to a particular place, maybe to a particular place in the house, maybe just a kitchen fire and not destroying the whole house. And so when we think about how on earth does a fire destroy an entire city, we have to remember how the city was developed. And during that time, the roofs were completely made out of wood. And you also have the buildings, which was like tinder. And so as the flames were just gushing into this one house, the winds would blow the embers and would blow the fans or fan the flame, if you will, to another building, and then another building and another building. And the fire department came and was trying to put out the fire, but this was a wildfire that quickly grew out of control, and even the fire truck was burned in the process, wasn't able to control. And the next thing you know, you have blankets, water buckets, people trying to do all that they can, and ultimately all that they could do was basically run for their lives.
Yeah, and it must have been a very horrifying thing. Going back to the letter of Henry Rowland, he talks about the fact, like you said, that everybody had just got out of church. It was a nice day, and then a little past 12 noon there on that day, fire is first reported, and in less than an hour, he says, quote, "Our village was literally a sea of flame in less than an hour." And one of the more interesting things that I think that I didn't think about when I was first approaching this, but the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. But one of the things people did to try to save the city was they sacrificed their own homes or buildings, as they would take gunpowder and literally blow up their buildings, blow up their home in an attempt to deny the fire of more fuel, to deny the fire of another structure to hop onto and burn. So people weren't just simply losing their homes and their businesses to the fire itself. They were losing their homes and their businesses to self-destruction, so to speak.
And they saw the fire coming. And that's the thing that is absolutely horrifying, is that you look down the street and you saw the fire as it was moving closer and closer and closer. And so those individuals ran into their homes, grabbed whatever they could. They had their possessions, their belongings, and they tried to take them out, thinking that they would have time. And as they brought them out and as they moved down the street trying to get away from the fire, they couldn't outrun the fire.
Right.
And so you imagine knowing you're going to lose your home, but thinking you've escaped with belongings that you'll be able to hold on to, and then having to drop the belongings because it's weighing you down and the fire is getting closer and closer to you, and you are overwhelmed with heartache and sadness and exhaustion. And so you abandon everything you have. But then you had people that were spread out, families in different churches, maybe they were at different places. And so you've got parents wanting to make sure that their children are near them. You're wanting to make sure that, where's, Aunt Sally? She's supposed to be here. And so all of this is going on. And then what about the people who are sick? What about the elderly who can't get out of the building fast enough? And so as you're trying to protect your own belongings and your own family, we see this acts of bravery with the citizens of Fayetteville who go in and try to help bring out the sick and have to basically leave them in the streets, but at least they get them out of that tinder box of matches that's going to go up in flames. And you talk about how gunpowder was the only thing that was going to save, everything from being destroyed. I mean, my gosh, we lost 600 buildings. And I think it was like, 105 stores, just
Yep.
about every house, every church, except for the Methodist church, which was down the road. It wasn't in the area where the fire was going on. But you are experiencing a war zone, utter desolation, everything destroyed. And then you have to think about the effects after the fire. You've blown up your own house. You've left your belongings. You've got your family, but all you have are the clothes on your back. And pretty quickly, you can't just run to the store and get medicine. You can't run to the store and get goods because there's no longer anything left in your city. And Ray, you would think that this would have brought about multiple casualties, that a lot of people would have lost their lives. But I think that's another interesting aspect of this, is with all of this devastation and destruction. And this fire was basically like in 4 hours had engulfed the entire city. Maybe we should talk about the fortuitous nature of the individuals and how they lost everything. But fortunately, when it came to losing lives, maybe we can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, nobody was killed. There were people who were injured, many people who were injured. And of course, there was a lot of people who lost their homes, their businesses, their churches. Even First Presbyterian Church there in Fayetteville was destroyed. We may talk a little bit more about that later. And of course, most of this, none of it, very little of it was actually insured. So many people in the city lost everything. And it's interesting, our records show that the night of the fire, the night of May 29, 1831, the residents of Fayetteville literally huddled together outside of the city or outside of the town. and stayed on the outskirts of the city overnight there because they had lost everything. They had nowhere to go. They had no one to turn to but themselves, and so they went out into the outskirts of the city and stayed there overnight.
You mentioned earlier about Reverend Rowland, who was the pastor of the church there, the Presbyterian church. And, one of the things, he's probably our best witness, if you will, to the Fayetteville Fire of 1831. And he, as you have mentioned, he wrote many firsthand accounts that he would use to send out to people across the country, showing that this is a devastating thing that has happened. But I remember some of his writings and some of the things that he said. And just for our readers to have an idea, just imagine what's going on. These are his words. He said, and I quote, "Our dwellings and our sanctuaries enveloped in a whirlwind of flame, suddenly to find in the midst of our homes a burning monster whose breath was desolation, whose rage no art could tame, no power destroy, who swallowed up the affluent in a moment and left the widow and the orphan shelterless, who seemed to sport in the very miseries he created and signalized himself only by the complete and utter destruction of everything within his reach." End quote. You listen to that and you put yourself in the streets of downtown Fayetteville in this time period, and we've experienced hurricanes and tornadoes and we've experienced hardship, but I don't know if we can really speak to the fact where your city is gone. And you have, as you mentioned, to sleep out in the open air. There's no shelter, there's no hotel, there's no home, there's nothing. I can't imagine the tragedy, and the tragedy being that many people don't know about this.
Yeah. And Reverend Henry Rowland, you talk about the sermon there you just quoted from, you can almost hear parts of what he saw and what he experienced in his sermon there, because he talks about the First Presbyterian Church there. And he says the tall steeple of the church seemed like a pyramid of fire before it collapsed. And you just try to picture and almost go back to the fire at Notre Dame a few years ago, that same type of imagery there of such a magnificent building being on fire and the steeple just simply falling through the ceiling of the church. And of course, Chris, it wasn't just simply stores and homes and hotels, a school and churches that were destroyed. Some very important historical locations were also destroyed as a result of the fire. The most important, I think, being the old State House there, which had served at one point as the state's capital. It was where the state of North Carolina had ratified the U.S. Constitution in 1789, and it was also where the state of North Carolina chartered UNC, the University of North Carolina. So, a location so important with such history was just taken out by this fire.
Yeah, Ray, you are the resident expert of Fayetteville due to your upbringing in the area. Maybe if you could just, you gave a great illustration when we were talking about doing this episode about kind of like being in downtown Fayetteville. And, maybe some of our listeners are familiar with Fayetteville, maybe they're not, but maybe just use that example that you shared with me about what it would be like utter desolation that occurred there.
Yeah, if you go to Fayetteville nowadays and you go to the Market House, and I would encourage our listeners, if they haven't done so, to go back and listen to our episode on the Market House. The Market House sits there between Green and Rowan and Hay Street, and it's sort of a circle. There's a traffic circle going around it. And of course, the Market House was built there on the spot of the former Old State House, and the ruins of the Old State House lie below where the Market House currently stands. But if you go to that location, and it's really easy to do this because it is in that circle, and you stand inside that Market House and you look all around you, you take a 360-degree view, every building you see was built after the 1831 fire, because that whole area was destroyed. Every single one of the buildings that are there were built after 1831, because everything that was there before that was absolutely devastating. And if you think about, today people think about Fayetteville and they think about, spanning all the way out to Hope Mills and Fort Bragg and Spring Lake, and just such a large city. At the time, it was not that large. It was a small town in many ways at that time. And as Henry Rowland said, Fayetteville is no more. And he wasn't being overly dramatic. It was absolutely true. Everything that made up the city of Fayetteville at that time, as far as its physicality was concerned, everything was absolutely gone.
And where there used to be a thriving city, and all of a sudden all that there was were basically maybe chimneys just standing in the air where homes used to be, and everything else destroyed. If the story ended there, it would be a tragedy without hope. And yet we know today, based on what you've said and readers knowing about Fayetteville or listeners knowing about Fayetteville, we know that it didn't end there. No. That while there is Henry Rowland's statement, as you mentioned, Fayetteville is no more, we also know that he had another statement. And in that sermon that he gave on the rededication of the church, he said this, and quote, "We meet not on the ruins of past devastation, but in this house, which has since been reared for the worship of God. We see around us, touched with the untiring hand of human industry, as with a fabled wand of enchantment, these ruins disappearing from our view, and in their place, whole streets are rising at once from the ashes and resounding with the hum of business." And I think that there's the beauty that comes out of the ashes. Because this was a rebuilding campaign that did not just involve the people of Fayetteville, but that there was this unified effort throughout the United States of America. Because one man, Mr. Rowland, gave accounts to the newspapers in New York, who then passed the information along, where people understood that this was a tragedy, and that we needed to unite behind Fayetteville, North Carolina, and help them rebuild. And so in 1831, people, companies, businesses all throughout the United States, they sent in money to help rebuild Fayetteville.
Yeah, and one of the people who sent in money was President Andrew Jackson. He sent a gift of $50 to the city of Fayetteville to help it build back from the fire. And of course, $50, that doesn't sound like a lot of money today, but it would have been much more money back then. And overall, I think it was over $100,000 was raised to help the city of Fayetteville. And it was coming from places like New York, Raleigh, Wilmington, Washington, D.C. The money was coming from everywhere. And Chris, that brings us to the next topic we want to look at today, and that is the fire of Raleigh. Also in 1831, just a few weeks later, the city of Raleigh had helped the city of Fayetteville, help the citizens of Fayetteville start on that road to recovery, start on that road to rebuilding. And then just a short while later, the city of Raleigh is going to face a similar, though not nearly as devastating fire, but a fire that could have had a major impact on the city of Raleigh and the history of North Carolina.
One of the things is that we're always, I guess you could say, Monday morning quarterback, and we're always looking at what happened in Fayetteville. So you have Raleigh and Greensboro and other places that are saying, okay, what happened in Raleigh cannot and must not happen again. And so they start to do some investigation. And as they're starting to do some investigation, their minds are also drawn to the fact that, oh my gosh, the building where we ratified the Constitution is no longer. Here we are in Raleigh, is the seat of government for North Carolina. We have our state house, and they're looking up at the state house and saying, we have a wooden roof. And if we're not careful, the same thing could happen, maybe not to the extent that it happened in Fayetteville, but losing a building, whether by fire or by insurrectionist, if you will. When something goes into a building that is seen as where democracy lies and where it's the seat of government, you do all that you can to protect it, to make sure, because it is a living symbol of where you've been, how you've gotten to that point and where you're going. And so they hire a general contractor whose name is Thomas Bragg, who comes into Raleigh and says, okay, my job is to fireproof this building to make sure that if there was a fire, that this building will not be burnt to the ground. And so I think what he do for I think it was $2,000, he decides that he's going to go and fix the roof. And he's got a pretty interesting way, I think, that he wants to go about and fix the roof.
Yeah, his idea, like you said, about $2,000 was to plate the roof with sheets of zinc. I'm not a construction person, never built anything in my life, nor would you want me to. But that's an interesting idea, to replace the wood with zinc. And of course, they are making progress on this. And one of the ideas they have is to prevent the roof from leaking. They decide to solder the nails, I guess, to prevent the roof from becoming porous where the nails were, so that it would be less likely to leak. And then, of course, on June 21st, 1831, some of Bragg's workers are up there on the roof of the building very early in the morning. It's a foggy day, it's a rainy day, and the workers are passing iron pots of fire, these smoldering pots, back and forth through the roof in order to heat the nails and solder the zinc plates. And they take a break, apparently, for breakfast, leaving the iron pots there on the roof. And Chris, within just a few minutes, smoke is pouring out of the west wing of this Capitol that was being fixed, so to speak, so it wouldn't burn.
Yeah, one of the worst things of being a contractor is taking your break and looking up and seeing the work that you were working all of a sudden is up in smoke. And I'm sure that they rushed to action and tried to do everything that they can to keep the Capitol from doing what they had hoped it would not do, which is to burn down. And so you have a mad scramble of activity, both trying to control the fire, but also trying to save the records that were in there. And Ray, for our readers who do not know, that you have such a strong fascination and love for our first president of the United States, George Washington, I know that you had to have been just full of great sadness when you found out that one of the things that happened because of this fire is that there was this statue of George Washington that was actually in the Capitol. And as they were trying to rescue the archives and the materials, they were trying to take the statue out, but they couldn't. Yeah. And so this statue of Washington was mutilated and basically just destroyed, and along with some of the records, but ultimately the Capitol is gutted and becomes a burned out shell, which is, while not like it was in Fayetteville, it's still extremely devastating because, once again, this is the seat of government. This is where everything happens.
Yeah. And, it's not going to be devastating because it destroys homes and businesses and churches. It doesn't. It destroys this one building. The fire is relegated to this one building. But of course, like you said, this is the seat of government. This is not just any building. This is the Capitol building of the state of Raleigh. And this fire actually put Raleigh in danger of losing the Capitol. I mean, there was a movement afoot after this fire that, well, maybe we need to move the Capitol somewhere else. And once again, there was a move in the legislature there in Raleigh to move the Capitol back to Fayetteville, where it had been for a short period of time in the 18th century. And one person I read, Chris, said that, the only reason for Raleigh's existence was the Capitol at this point in time. So, if the Capitol burned and people didn't think very highly of Raleigh, then, well, we'll just move it somewhere else and we'll rebuild somewhere else. And Fayetteville looked like a good opportunity for them.
Especially because of the history of Fayetteville, having been the state house where the Constitution was ratified. I think that there was a growing group of people who said, well, I mean, Raleigh is Raleigh, but really there's nothing about Raleigh, because even in the history of North Carolina, you'll talk about New Bern, you talk about, other places, but really Raleigh's not mentioned until later on here. And so there was this drive to go back to where history allows us, go back to the place where Lafayette, gave a wonderful address, go back to the place where the Constitution was ratified. And so it doesn't happen. And Raleigh becomes the capital and where the state building is today and the seat of government as it is. But I do think that another thing that kind of happened with this is some people didn't push it as much because Fayetteville also remembered what Raleigh had done for them. They remembered that Raleigh had sent in money and sent in supplies. And so it was like, it might be pretty bad if we try to go and steal the government seat, the seat of government. We steal it because of a fire, when basically you were one of our first ones out there to help us during this particular time. So I think that might have had something to do with it also.
Yeah, and it was a Fayetteville newspaper editor who actually brought that issue up, because there were people in Fayetteville apparently who were, trying to get the capital back to the city of Fayetteville, understandably so. And it from some perspectives, it might make perfect sense. Fayetteville was rebuilding after their fire. Why not just go ahead and put a new Capitol building there in the process of rebuilding? But he reminded them, look, like you said, Chris, Raleigh had provided money, they had provided supplies, and now you're going to thank them by trying to take the capital away from them, which at this particular point in history may have been very, very devastating to the city of Raleigh and to the people of Raleigh. So it eventually works out that the legislature does decide to keep the capital there in Raleigh and to rebuild the capital there in Raleigh. And in December of 1832, the General Assembly gave $50,000 for the capital's reconstruction, where it is today. And of course, the citizens of Raleigh were very happy to see that the city was able to keep the capital, and that another city like Fayetteville or New Bern or somewhere else wasn't going to take it away from them.
I think the events of 1831 in Fayetteville and Raleigh offer up a lot of lessons for us in 2021 today. You and I, we and our listeners can look around, and there's been moments in which we've seen devastation all around us. We recall some of the devastating hurricanes, not just in North Carolina, but throughout the United States. We've seen what war can do. We've seen natural disasters besides hurricanes. And there are times, I am sure, in which we've looked out in our homes and we've seen desolation. And maybe it's not in a physical sense. Maybe it's in the sense of broken homes or broken relationships or unemployment or poverty or whatever it might be. And, Ray, as we look at this story today, I just can't help but we have to recognize that out of tragedy, there is hope. And I think the people of Fayetteville and I think the people of Raleigh both saw that. They saw the need to rebuild, but they didn't just see the need to rebuild on their own, but they saw the need to rebuild as a community. And once again, I go back to thinking about Reverend Rowland and how he stated. He says, last thing that I'll quote from him, he says, "We cannot view the changes which the past year has witnessed and remember the kindness which in every part of our country was felt for our distress, and which poured forth to our relief the most sensible tokens of their sympathy, without feeling that the Lord hath done great things for us." Too often, Ray, we focus on the bad things. We focus on the desolation and the unhappiness and the misery that seems to be around us. But there are times in which we need to look out of our doors and we need to see that there is kindness in this world. There are good people. There is hope. And we just need to take a moment and we need to recognize the opportunity to give thanks.
Very well said. Very well said. And I think, Chris, we'll stop it right there for today. Thank you for all your research and work on this particular episode. I hope our listeners will go back and review the episode we did on the Market House there in Fayetteville. We also have an episode on Wilmington, North Carolina, specifically the visit of George Washington to that city there. I believe it was in 1791. So I hope everybody will go back and listen to those episodes and the previous episodes that we've done as well. So you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and you can contact us at historyyousshouldknow@gmail.com. That's history, the letter you should know @gmail.com. Until next time, I'm Ray.
Chris.
And we'll see you later.